My dad said, "Tell me why you won't come on this vacation." I said, "Because I hate your wife." He went silent for a full minute. My father sat across from me in a packed restaurant, surrounded by grandparents and in-laws and a waiter holding a sparkler cake, and asked me for the 6th time why I didn't want to come on the family vacation. On the 6th ask, I answered. The sparkler was still hissing when his wife stood up and started screaming at me in front of everyone. I didn't raise my voice back. I didn't apologize. I recorded the whole thing, and what happened next is the reason I'm writing this at all. Original post. I'm 17, and when I was 9 years old, my dad started sleeping with one of my mother's close friends. He left our house, married her, and they now have 3 kids together. My dad was granted weekend custody. For years he showed up, tried to be present, tried to include me in things, and I want to be fair about that because some of it was real. But from the beginning, being with his new wife and building his new family always seemed to matter more to him than simply spending time with me. He pushed me to call her mom almost from the start. He went for full custody twice. And every attempt to tighten his grip on my schedule felt less like love and more like a display, the kind of fatherhood you perform for an audience rather than live when no one is watching. I stopped going to his house when I was 14. The official reason I gave was that I was busy, that I had school and friends and a life of my own that didn't need restructuring. The real reason I kept to myself for a long time. His wife had cornered me one afternoon when my dad was out of earshot and told me, calm and direct and without any particular cruelty in her voice, just flatness, that I was an obstacle to my father's happiness and that I should consider staying with my mom full time. I was 12 when she said that. I didn't tell anyone. I just started finding reasons not to go. 5 days ago, it was their anniversary. I didn't want to attend, and I made that clear. My dad called my mother and threatened court proceedings if I didn't show up, so I went. He'd reserved a large table at a nice restaurant, his parents, his in-laws, his wife, all 3 kids, and me slotted in at the end like an obligation he'd dressed up as affection. Partway through the evening, he announced he had 6 vacation tickets. He went around the table with that proud, controlled smile of his, describing the trip, and then he looked directly at me and said one of the tickets was mine. I said, quietly, that I wasn't going. He asked why. I didn't answer. He asked again, and on the 6th time, when his voice had shifted from patient to something harder, I gave him the answer he'd been pressing for. Because I hate your wife. The table went still the way rooms only go still when something private has finally been said in public. Forks stopped moving. His parents froze. The waiter appeared at the edge of the table holding a small chocolate anniversary cake with a single sparkler, the word happy anniversary written in shaky icing, and he stood there looking between us like he genuinely didn't know whether to set it down or back away slowly. His wife stood up first. She pointed at me and called me ungrateful, then launched into a tirade about how I had poisoned every attempt at family unity, how I had never given her a real chance, how everything that had gone wrong between us was a product of my bitterness rather than her behavior. Her voice climbed with each sentence while my younger half-sibling sat wide-eyed across the table, confused in the way small children get confused when the adults they trust start coming apart at the seams. My dad tried to get her to sit down. She kept going. He eventually snapped at her to stop, which only made things louder, and for a few minutes the restaurant became exactly the kind of scene that my dad had spent years trying to ensure never happened in public. I sat through it quietly. I didn't yell back. I didn't cry. I let her keep going because I had stopped trying to manage the temperature of rooms I hadn't set on fire. My dad looked at me through gritted teeth and told me to apologize. I said no, pushed my untouched plate aside, stood up, and walked out. I could feel every pair of eyes at the table following me to the door. I didn't turn around to check. Update 1. The morning after the dinner, I woke up to a wall of texts from my dad cycling between anger and confusion, and a series of voice notes from his wife calling me toxic, telling me I was no longer welcome in their home, and informing me that I had ruined the vacation she'd spent months planning. I didn't respond to any of it. When my dad called my mother to complain that I had humiliated him in public and demanded she handle me better, she hung up on him and came directly to my room. I told her everything that night, including the parts one had never said out loud before. How his wife had cornered me when I was 12 and told me I was standing in the way of my father's happiness. How she was warm and cooperative whenever he was watching and cold and contemptuous the moment he left the room. How she'd pushed me toward the edges of every gathering, quietly and consistently, until showing up felt worse than staying away. My mom wasn't surprised. She looked sad in that particular way people look when something they suspected for years is finally confirmed. She told me she was on my side, that she always had been, and that I never had to keep pretending things were fine to protect everyone else's comfort. A few days later, a letter arrived addressed to me. Not from my dad, but from his father, my grandfather, handwritten on good paper in his neat, careful script. He said that family meant making room for forgiveness, that I should think of the younger kids who had done nothing wrong and would grow up believing I hated them if I kept my distance. He asked to meet for coffee, no pressure, just a conversation. I read it twice, placed it in my drawer, and didn't answer. I needed more time before I could decide what opening that door was actually going to cost me. What came next wasn't patience from my dad's side. It was pressure. His messages escalated from men appeals to comments about how I owed my half-siblings an explanation, and eventually to a line about how if I kept behaving this way I was no better than my mother. That one didn't wound me the way he probably expected. It just made me understand more clearly who I was dealing with, a man who had burned his own family down and was now trying to use the smoke as a weapon. His wife followed up with a long message wrapped in false concern, telling me that her youngest daughter had cried for 2 hours after the dinner thinking her big brother hated her, and that I was old enough to rise above my resentment and show some maturity. This, from the woman who told a 12-year-old he was an obstacle to his father's happiness and smiled while saying it. I still didn't respond. But I couldn't stop thinking about those kids. Update 2. I reached out to my dad and told him I would come by once to say goodbye to his children. Just them. His reply came within minutes, all enthusiasm and exclamation points, like he decided this was a breakthrough rather than what it actually was, a courtesy extended to 3 small people who had nothing to do with what their parents had done to mine. I recorded everything from the moment I walked through the front door. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, the difference between coming in blind and coming in ready. My dad met me with dad jokes and a performance of normalcy that would have been almost impressive if I didn't know him as well as I do. I walked past him, said hello, and asked where the kids were. They ran in from the backyard and piled into me like I'd been gone a week instead of years, asking about my sketchbook, whether I still liked dinosaurs, whether I remembered a particular bedtime song. I held it together. I knelt down and hugged them back and let myself be present for about an hour, board games, a bit of soccer on the grass, reading to the youngest on the couch. For stretches of that afternoon I felt something close to normal, the particular warmth that doesn't require anything from you except to show up. And then the oldest, 9 years old and watching me carefully the way perceptive kids do, looked up from the drawing he was working on and asked, without any preamble, whether I still hated his mom. Before I could find any version of an answer that wouldn't harm a 9-year-old with the truth it deserved, his mother appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, wearing a smile that didn't reach anything above her jaw, and said it was time to give me some space. The kids were moved out. She sat down across from me, crossed her legs, and told me that I had confused the children, hurt them, and undone years of healing in a single afternoon. I stared at her and said nothing. She added that I wasn't the victim here, just someone bitter because I couldn't control how life had turned out. When I stood up to leave, she moved in front of me and lowered her voice and told me that if I tried to turn the kids against her again, she would make sure I was legally barred from seeing them. I told her I thought she'd already handled that on her own. She said, quietly, that I should watch myself and that she wasn't afraid to get legal. I walked down the driveway, got into my mom's car, and sat with my phone in my hand and the audio still running. Update 3. That night I sat with my mom and stepfather in the kitchen and played them the full recording. My stepfather, who has always been the calmest person in any room he enters, listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when it finished he said, simply, that they needed to know I wasn't afraid anymore. My mom nodded and said the same thing in different words. We talked for hours about what came next. The risks, the fallout, the reality that once something goes public it stops being a private war and becomes something else entirely. What tipped me wasn't the threats on the recording, as clean and damning as they were. It was remembering my little brother's question. Still hated mommy. 9 years old and already carrying weight that nobody his age should have to hold. I spent the following week pulling together everything I had. Not just the audio from the visit but text messages going back years, emails, a pattern of behavior documented across time. A friend from school had an older brother who ran a small podcast about family estrangement, post-divorce dynamics, the quiet damage that doesn't show up in any official record. I sent the files anonymously and asked if the material was too risky to work with. He replied in 2 hours and said it was the most real and gutting thing he'd read in months, and asked if I would speak on it. I said yes, anonymously, voice altered, no identifying names. The episode dropped and it did not do what I expected. It detonated. Maybe it was the detail about being told at 12 that I was an obstacle to my father's happiness. Maybe it was the audio clip of a woman threatening to have me legally removed from her children's lives while calling herself the victim. Whatever it was, something in it struck something real in people, and the shares and comments came faster than I could track. People who had been erased by remarried parents, stepchildren who had spent years being managed out of their own families, adults who had finally stopped pretending the rejection hadn't shaped them. They found something in it that apparently needed saying, and I had been the one to say it. My dad and his wife figured out the episode was about them within 2 days. The threats came fast, voicemails, accusations of defamation, mentions of lawyers and custody court, the same machinery they had always reached for when pressure wasn't working. I saved every one. Then my dad showed up at my school, waiting in the parking lot. When I came out and he stepped into my path, he asked if I thought I was a man now, doing this to my own family. I looked at him and said that he had stopped being my family when he let her break me. I walked past him to my mom's car. He didn't follow. He just stood there watching, like he wasn't quite sure who he was looking at. Update 4. That night, something none of us expected happened. My youngest half-sister, 5 years old, found a tablet and called my mom's number, crying, asking why I hated them, saying her parents were fighting and blaming her for making the call. I stayed on with her until she calmed down, told her she was loved, that she hadn't done anything wrong. When the call ended and I handed my mom her phone, I understood that the situation had become something more complicated than a personal reckoning. These kids were being used as cover. And if I was going to do this properly, I needed to go further than a podcast. I reached out to Mark. He was my dad's closest friend before the affair, the man who had introduced them at a work event and watched the whole thing unfold from the inside before quietly disappearing from our lives when the marriage collapsed. I tracked him down through someone we both knew and sent him a message with a single question. He replied the next day with a phone number. When I called, he was cautious at first, using the language of people who have spent years deciding whether to stay quiet. But I told him everything, the recording, the threats, the kids, the years of being systematically edged out, and he exhaled and said he'd always thought it would end this way. Then he started talking. Really talking. He told me she had targeted my dad from the beginning, that she had asked Mark directly whether he thought my dad would leave his wife if he had a real woman in his life, that what Mark had dismissed as a joke turned into secret lunches and late nights and a deliberate unraveling of everything our family had been. He told me how she had slowly restructured my dad's world, his time, his friendships, his loyalties, until the people who questioned it got cut off and she became the only narrative he trusted. When Mark had tried to warn him, my dad called him jealous and stopped returning his calls. And then Mark said the line that I keep coming back to. She never wanted me in the picture. She had told him directly, once, that it was a package deal and she didn't want the package. Those words, delivered in a quiet voice on the other end of a phone call I almost didn't make, landed in me like something I had been holding my breath for since I was 12 years old. Not a new wound. Confirmation of an old one. The kind that stops hurting differently once you know it was real. Mark agreed to give an anonymous statement. The podcast host helped shape it into a follow-up episode alongside the documents I had gathered, building a timeline that covered the affair, the manipulation, the deliberate campaign to erase a child from a life he had been in first. It was careful, anonymized, and still completely clear to anyone who already knew us. Update 5. While the follow-up was in production, I went to a park near the kids' school and waited at a distance until I saw them come out. I didn't approach. I just watched them for a while. 3 small people with my dad's eyes and none of his excuses, running around in the kind of uncomplicated joy that hasn't been explained to them yet. I sat on a bench and wrote them each a letter. One for now, one for when they're older, and one for when they're ready to understand all of it without it being filtered through someone else's version of events. The day the second episode dropped, my dad sent me the longest message I had ever received from him. He said he never meant to hurt me, that things had spiraled beyond what he'd intended, that he loved me and was begging me not to do something that would destroy what remained of the family. I read it 3 times, then I typed one line back. You did that a long time ago. This is just the truth catching up. I didn't send it yet because there was still one more thing I didn't know. My mom had mentioned weeks before that there was something buried, something she had kept from me to protect me but that I was now old enough to hear. That night I sat down with her and said, plainly, tell me what he did. She reached into her desk and took out a battered envelope, and inside it was a copy of a paternity test from when I was an infant. My dad had demanded it even though they were married, even though I looked exactly like him, and when the results confirmed what anyone paying attention already knew, he had told her I couldn't be his because I demanded too much from him, because I had complicated everything about the marriage from the moment I arrived. I sat with that information for a long time. And then, quietly, a lot of things rearranged themselves. The distant way he held me in baby photos, the sense I always had of being tolerated rather than wanted, the way he had devoted himself to his second family with an intensity that sometimes looked, from the outside, like he was trying to get something right that he had already decided he'd gotten wrong the first time. My mom told me the rest slowly, the years of emotional punishment he had put her through before the affair, the way she had fought to hold things together while he looked for reasons to be somewhere else. And when she stopped letting him use her as a target, he found someone who would make him feel like an authority instead of a partner. Someone who built a world around him and needed him to be the center of it. Update 6. The following week, I recorded one final entry for the podcast. Not a retaliation, not a list of accusations, just an account. The letters, the test, the 12-year-old being told he was an obstacle, the years spent trying to earn a place in a house where the decision about him had already been made. I ended it by saying I was not broken, that I had simply never been seen, and signed off. The messages that came in afterward were different from the first wave. Less rage, more recognition. People who had been the unwanted child in a stepfamily, people who had spent their adult lives chasing approval from a parent who had decided early that they were the complicated one, people who had been told to get over something enormous and had spent years pretending they had. They wrote in the way people write when they have been waiting a long time to find out someone else understood. A few days later, I mailed the letters to my half-siblings, sealed, addressed in my handwriting, with small drawings on the outside that I knew they'd recognize. Not now, but someday. I sent my dad's final message, the response I had drafted. You did that a long time ago. This is just the truth catching up to you. Then I blocked his number. Not impulsively, not in anger, but with the particular clarity that comes from having finally said what needed saying and having nothing left that required his acknowledgement to be true. His wife I never heard from again, at least not directly. I imagine she's still constructing her version of this story for whatever audience will hold still long enough to hear it. But she is no longer invisible. She is no longer unchallenged. For someone who spent years operating in the comfortable dark of a husband who believed her and a stepchild who stayed quiet, that's its own kind of consequence. I started therapy a few months ago. Not to dismantle the past but to learn how to carry it without letting it determine everything that comes after. I've been reconnecting with my stepfather, who has never once tried to replace anyone, who showed up quietly and consistently and asked for nothing in return, and who told me once that being a father had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with who stays. I think about that a lot. I think about those kids too. I hope their version of this story, when they're old enough to read it, comes from the letters I wrote them rather than from whatever their parents decide to edit it into. I hope they grow up knowing that their brother was not bitter or broken or jealous, just someone who got there first and was asked to make room he didn't have to make. Edit, for everyone asking whether I regret saying it in public, at a dinner table, in front of grandparents and small children and a waiter with a sparkler, no. I had been saying it quietly for 5 years and nobody had listened. Saying it out loud, in a room full of people, was the first time in my life that silence wasn't the only option I could afford. Edit 2, for the people asking about Mark and whether I felt guilty involving him. Mark chose to pick up the phone. He chose to talk. He had been carrying his own guilt about his role in what happened for over a decade, and telling the truth was the first thing he'd done about it. I didn't recruit him. I just gave him somewhere to put what he already knew. Edit 3, for the people asking what I would say to my father now, after all of it, I already said it. I hope you raised them better than you did me. Everything else I kept for myself.